KJ Method's YouTube channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video for all who may be interested. Well, today I've decided to do a topic that always has students scratching their head. How do we do prorations? I want you to understand that prorations are actually fairly simple. The problem is students are often all over the place when they do each proration problem. You need to do your proration problems the same way every single time. And if you do that, I promise you that you can prorate anything. So what are the rules relating to prorations? Number one, you are always going to make yourself a timeline so that you can get a visual of what is going on. Your timeline length is going to be how often you make the payment. And so if it's taxes and insurance, we pay that per year. So our timeline is going to be a year long. We are going to start our timeline on the due date given, and we are going to end our timeline a year later. This often presents problems for students because if the timeline is January 1st, students can easily end it December 31st. But what about if your timeline starts on August 7th? Well, the end date is August 6th of the next year. So what do I say to my students? I always say stop your timeline one day before the next day that it is due. If there is no due date given in the example, just start your timeline on the first of the year. Then I want you to note the closing date on your timeline. And I want you to put it approximately where it should go on the timeline. And I'll explain a little bit more of that later. Next, remember that the seller always pays for the closing day and the buyer doesn't begin paying until the day after closing. So what we say is the buyer actually owns the house the day after closing, and that's the time that the buyer is going to start paying for the house. So let's take a look at an example. All right, so this first one is an insurance and taxes. It's going to be a 1-year timeline, of course, and I have it already set up so that we can move forward with it. So look at the due date is January 1st, and the closing date is going to be April 18th. And so if I set up my timeline, it's going to look something like this. You see that I started it on January 1st and I ended it on December 31st. My closing date is noted on April 18th, and it's noted kind of like where it would sit in the calendar. I do this for a reason, because some proration problems you can just figure out without even doing any math at all. All right, so we have our timeline set up. So let's look and see what happened. The seller obviously would have paid for that entire year because the seller was the only one in the house. But the seller only used this left-hand side because the seller is leaving and closing on the 18th. So the seller is going to want to get the rest of the year back. All right, so the seller paid for that right-hand side, 4/19 to 12/31, but did not use that side. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about prorations? We're talking about who owes who as of the date of closing. And so if you look at this and you evaluate it, what we're actually saying is that the buyer is moving into the house on 4/19 and going to remain there until 12/31. So the buyer is going to have to give money back to the seller for those days. And so what we just need to calculate is how many days is that. Once we're able to do that, we'll know how much the buyer owes the seller. Well, anytime your account is going to go down, the buyer's account is going to go down, right? We call that a debit. Anytime your account is going to go up, we call that a credit. So think about it. The buyer is going to be debited for 4/19 to 12/31. What are we going to do? And then take that money and give it right to the seller's pocket. And so the seller is going to be credited for that same period of time. Now it becomes easy. Let's just figure out how many days is that. And so we look at this same period of time, and now we have to count the days in order to figure it out. All right, the biggest problem that you're going to have here is always on calculating partial months. Partial months. We can pretty much always calculate the full months, right? May, June, July, August. But if you look at it on the board, we have April 19th to the 30th. Now, you guys need to know how many days there are in every month, all right? But if you can do that, if you look at May, June, all the way to December, those are easy because those are full months. Where you're going to make your big mistake is on partial months. Students do it all the time. And so I have a way to force you to get the answer correct every single time. What are you going to do? When you hit a partial month, you're going to just go, uh-oh, I'm at a partial month. What do I need to do? I want you to take the outside date of the month, subtract it from the inside date of the month, and then add 1 to it. I want you to do it like that on every single partial month. It will force you to get the answer correct. So in this scenario, we're going to take 30 minus 19. You're going to get 11, right? And then you're going to add 1. Why am I forcing you to do that? Because we always make a mistake and we forget to actually count the 19th. We need to count that day. And if you did it on your fingers, 19 all the way to 30, you would also get the number 12. And so if we add all of that up, that totals 257 days. Now, I always have my students calculate your days before your dollars. Always. It makes it a whole lot easier. You don't have to worry about rounding issues and things of that nature in the end. And so let's take a look at these 257 days and see what it's really worth. Again, we have our same timeline that we had before. Let's say that these taxes were $3,500. And what we're trying to count is this right side of the timeline, right? Again, we're trying to count that 4/19 to 12/31. And we now know that it is 257 days for that entire period of time. Well, it's pretty easy at this point because you're always going to divide by 365 when you have taxes and insurance. So let's look at how easy it is. You're going to take the number divided by 365. So you have 3,500 divided by 365. For our purposes here, I'm going to say $9.59 a day. But if this was just in your calculator, you would actually be able to go 3,500 divided by 365 and just multiply it by the 257, and you will get $2,464.38. A buyer debit. We're going to take that money from the buyer and we are going to give it to the seller. Now, sometimes students have difficulty remembering the proration rules. Just make sure that you look through this video on more than one occasion. If you remember this, you can pretty much prorate anything. Well, that's it for today, guys. Hopefully you learned something in terms of your prorations. Don't forget, again, to like, subscribe, and share this video to all who may be interested in learning about prorations. Well, see you next time. Thank you for coming to the KJ Methods YouTube channel. Bye-bye.